it's a 25 to 50% chance. Does this remind you of anything? Who it is, what it does. And it will teach you, oh, by the way, when we say something is a realistic possibility, we mean that it's a 25 to 50% chance. Does this remind you of anything? It reminds you, of course, of the super forecast people. Yes.
Just wondering why that scale had a 5% gap in between categories.
Because you don't want to give people the impression that you're actually doing science. It's loosey-goosey. Truly.
So you just avoid those 5% there always.
Yeah, there's always it's not science. It's social science. It's not well, not nonsense, but it's loosey-goosey. And by the way, when I write report for Arcano, we use the same appendix. When I say it is probable Donald Trump wins the election, unfortunately, we give clients the appendix. You can use this in business. Just a reminder, the reason you do this is most people don't use language that carefully. Super forecasters do. You at least want to live your life down here. But maybe you have the personality that allows you to live down here. But with Bayesian reasoning, you can get that right. So I hope parts of the class are coming together. Epidemiologists, when we were working through COVID and how far away do people need to stand, and should people be allowed to go back to schools, and should old people, only shop on Tuesday, all these choices that the government was trying to model about policy choices, they were working through Bayesian analysis. They were getting the best science they could at doing their best. I'm glad I didn't have to make those choices. I think in some ways, bad choices were made, but bad choices were made among a selection of a lot of bad choices. So Bayesian analysis is a useful thing. Learn it. Finally, thank God. We've escaped Bayesian analysis, however. Yes.
I asked something about that other case. Could you hide military guards as other professionals, like builders?
Well, believe me, we'll get to it. I promise. Because now we're in a world, the only screen we have is presidential guard. We know it's 17%. But you've still got 510 sites declared. What other things might you look for to filter the large number of sites? You can only search, say, another 50. What else would you look for? How do you suddenly you've got satellites at your disposal, you've got spies at your disposal, you've got signals intelligence specialists out there. The world is your oyster. If you're an intelligence collector, tell me what else you would look for. Come on.
We know Sansory is often at risk from invasion by its neighbors and things like that. So you probably assume that any facility developing WMDs would not be near borders, for example.
Okay, that's not a bad string. Everybody hear that? Maybe, because they're a little bit paranoid, they've been invaded before, they're not going to be like border towns. So if you've got any suspect sites, and you'd have to make a judgment. You have to say, well, what are we going to say, 100 kilometers from the border, 75, but yeah, maybe more in the center of the country is good. Other ideas. Remember, good analysis is creative. I'll give you some. Your colleagues start generating this. You start looking for scientists and doctors who were previously with the program, and then you say, where did they go? Are they working at particular universities or hospital staffs? Are they publishing work? Where are they now and what are they doing? You particularly want to focus on ones that you couldn't find easily. right? Because if they've moved to Imperial and they're working at Imperial on anti-COVID measures. Like, yes, okay, we can cross that person off. They're fine. Who's fallen off the radar? Who was working in a relevant field? Where are they now? Yes.
So it's just a question to your comment there. How would you deal with that when you deal with nations a bit more sophisticated, where you could have the idea of them playing back the same playbook? So you might put the person at the choice that makes you quickly disregard them.
So if they know that I know that they know that I know, it gets very complicated.
Right.
It's the answer. We're going to conclude this morning's session with the best tool I have. But here's a spoiler. No, won't do the spoiler. So you start looking for people. Where are they? Key people, yes. And
You can pretend to sell them the equipment that they technically need for their.
you can offer them equipment. That would be very useful. Useful indeed. So you might set up a company that does nothing but sell maharajing steel. Or, this is kind of sad, one of the very important things that you use to hide weapons of mass destruction programs is anti-pollution technology. So if you see, frankly, a developing nation suddenly says, wow, they've ordered 10 million pounds worth of water filtration, highly advanced water filtration systems. You're like, they've never cared about their sewage that much before. Why are they suddenly really caring about cleaning certain water? Because they're probably making something they shouldn't.
Could you look for unusual electricity or energy usage
Yes.
at night?
So one, the way the Israelis found the site, the nuclear refinement site that the Syrians were setting up in 2008, that was successfully blown up and then not talked about at Al Kabir, was there were power lines going to the middle of nowhere. It was a pretty well disguised facility, but it's not particularly good for nuclear. The biological stuff is different, but it's the same idea. So you look for people. You'd also gather rumors. Like, is there a new secret enclave being set up? Have any trusted officers or rising stars not been seen around lately? And if so, where are they rumored to have moved? You can do really boring stuff, like figure out the call signs and imagery of all existing presidential guard units and figure out who's recently moved. These things are constantly updated. Movies give you the impression that there's like one secret you can steal that unlocks the key to everything. And there isn't. It's usually about a collection of facts placed in a context that says, gee, that's a big indicator. But very rarely is one thing in itself utterly decisive. It's always about facts in context. And it can be as boring as these units moved, those scientists moved, a new power plant was built, and there's been a new school set up and teachers recruited out in the middle of nowhere because military officers want their kids to go to good schools too. Yes.
Yeah. So this is a very obvious question, which probably might have been overlooked, but is it possible to be using a sleeper cell?
Sleeper cell.
Yeah.
So is it possible we already have a human penetration that's telling us whether it's N3? No, we unfortunately we don't. It could be that you do, but
Even if we did, we wouldn't test it.
first of all, you never want one spine organization. You need at least 3 who don't know about each other. And they don't know. So you're always trying to triangulate information. You need multiple sources. You can never have too many sources. There's rarely one hero spy. There's this guy, he's usually reliable. We think he's in it for the money. He's got a gambling problem. He may be inflating the information because we know he just lost on the horses this week, but he's saying something's going on in this town. But then we've got somebody else saying that. Let's look at that town more closely. But it makes beautiful plots of movies and books to have one decisive thing, but that's probably rarely the case. Yes.
You could also speak to former associated officials who left maybe a year or 2 years ago, maybe were fired,
Absolutely.
but collated information.
One of the best, I told you people spy for money, ideology, compromise, and ego, but revenge is another big thing. There was a complete son of a bitch named Edward Lee Howard. He's recruited by the CIA. He performs beautifully in training. He does so well in his initial training that he's selected to go to Moscow to service a very, very, very sensitive program. The United States had managed to bug the telephone cables between the Russian Defense Ministry and the Kremlin. And they had done it, frankly, through going into the sewers and tapping the lines. It was sort of cool. And his job, because he was so good at his trade craft, he was trained. There was a mock-up of the Soviet street that the sewer thing was located in. So he would practice going in and gaining access, and then he would practice on changing the batteries and changing the tapes. Back in the days of batteries and tapes, he was beautifully trained in all this for months. And by the way, the program to tap those lines had cost billions of dollars. Edward Lee Howard is trained to do this. Just before he's about to leave for Moscow, he's put on the lie detector one more time, and it pops up that maybe he's lying about drug use. So they drug test him, and he pops positive for cocaine. And what does the CIA do? They fire him. What is Edward Lee Howard? He moves back to Montana, drinks too much for about 3 months, and then he and his wife use the techniques he's learned to evade surveillance because there was very light surveillance on him. And he flies to Vienna, and he says to the Russians, "Hi, in exchange for $10 million in a beautiful life in Russia, I will tell you how America's listening to your phone calls between the defense ministry and the Kremlin." If you're going to fire people, please, 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 it's usually as cheapest to fire them nicely. He had felt that he was totally screwed, so he wanted revenge. And so the whole program was compromised, and he lived happily ever after in Moscow until just after 9/11, when Vladimir Putin and George W. Bush are actually getting along. Poor Mr. Howard tripped on the steps of his dacha outside Moscow and broke his neck. Just terrible. Just terrible. Construction is the thing. Now, you mentioned maybe you hide the guards as construction workers and stuff, but you're definitely looking at new buildings being built, strange buildings being built. By the way, we know what sort of air conditioning are needed for certain types of facilities. So we're going to look at, you've got AI watching the weekly satellite tape on buildings in Sans Serif that, that's funny. In the last 6 months, we've got 6 buildings with very advanced air conditioning units or HVAC systems on their roof. But again, if they know that you know, they'll start playing games with that. So what else could we do? What else could we do? Any further ideas? You're business people. Remember that. Remember, good analysis is created when you're given a task by your boss to analyze something. don't just go to the conventional normal measures. Think it through yourself. You might have a quite innovative breakthrough that will get you promoted. It really, good analysis is creative, yes.
Maybe you can also look at like financial flows because.
Thank
costs
you.
money.
You've got my hint about a business school. You can indeed. Let me get to financial flows. We have financial flows all the time you're looking at. So again, you're like, why does the Americans, why are they spying on all the banks? We want our financial privacy. We do that because often people do stuff like Pakistan knows what they want. They set up in some European country we're not going to name, they set up their purchasing network. They set up a front company in the United Arab Emirates. They go to a French industrial company who buys US electronic equipment. Then that electronic equipment goes to France, goes to UAE, and ends up in Pakistan. But by tracking the payments, you can follow the equipment. So money, following the money, is a good way. Another good way is to figure out what sort of equipment they might want and go to the manufacturers and say, hey, have you gotten weird customer queries? And businesses don't like this because they just want the business, right? They just want to make the sale. And so if you're coming to them and saying, hi, you have a good customer now located in country X, but have they been asking about, for example, have you said, we have a wonderful on-site group of trainers, and we're happy to send the trainers for this biological lab facility to your country to train your people in safe handling. And if they said, no, we don't want trainers coming to our facility. We'll send the trainers to you. You train our people there. That's a problem. You can do simple things like, gee, is this laboratory actually on Google Maps, a small office or residential address or whatever. All this stuff sounds so basic and so common sense, but you would be shocked at how often, like, I don't know if you followed the Wirecard scandal in Germany, or many short sellers uncover massive frauds because people just didn't do basic due diligence. They thought they're investing in, there was one famous case of an Indonesian logging firm. And they had quite a high valuation because they had huge stockpiles of timber. And a short selling firm simply went to where the stockpiles of timber and flew a drone over what appeared to be an enormous load of timber. And they figured out there were just piles in a circle, and the entire middle of the circle was empty. All you had to do was fly over it. You could see that, but people don't bother. In the Wirecard case, when the auditors ended up visiting the site of where the business partners in the Philippines, where billions were apparently held, it was like in a shopping mall, and the people listed on the invoices had never heard of that company. People don't do basic due diligence, and that's true for covert stuff as well as things like just simple fraud. Do I have anything else? So there are all these checklists that you really don't know that tell you whether a lab is suspicious or not. The point is, think. We're not going to do the DKs. We're going to take an early break. Then we'll come back and we'll do the DKs. I hope it will get a little more interesting. I know this is somewhat dry and abstract, but it is to encourage you to use analysis like Bayesian stuff where you can, and then get creative, think through other ways of solving problems. Okay, so if you can come back at 12 sharp, and we will keep at it. So well, to look at sensory, even try to decide if they have a program, evidence, things start flowing in. Read this stuff carefully and ask yourself, how would you weigh this information? What do you do with it? And this gets to the point somebody was asking, like, is there a technique apart from Bayesian analysis where you, but maybe some fact like this, you don't even know what to, you can't assign a probability to this. You know that G, a VPN that had been used for WMD activity, still exists, and the network's strongly encrypted because that bastard Edward Snowden allowed them to increase encryption. It still exists. You can't really assign a percentage to that, but does that mean Sans Serif still has a program going on or not? What do we do with that? So that piece of information comes in, and you don't know. Then this happens. You've got weird stuff with supply and demand of lab technicians and people working in biochemistry in Sans Serif. There's like a shortage. You can learn a lot, by the way, by reading the local newspapers. It's very hard to hide stuff like this. Somebody was asking at the break about what indicators and how would you know if there were to be an attempt to either invade a country like Ukraine or maybe seize Taiwan by force? How would you know? Well, there are indicators and warnings, and some of the things are things like, wow, are they increasing blood supplies? And it's really hard to hide when a nation suddenly says, yes, we want extra millions and millions of liters of blood in case people get wounded. That will be advertised in newspapers. And so will things like job openings for lab technicians. So this information starts flowing in. Then you've got an untested source saying, yeah, they were going to do it, convert biological warfare unit, but then the president came home, discovered they were considering this, and put a stop to it. Do countries, do parts of governments ever lie to their presidents? So, for example, the Pakistani military, none of them had any idea that Osama bin Laden was living on the outskirts of the equivalent of Sandhurst, their main military academy, for years. So parts of militaries can lie to the government, but sometimes the government can say that to cover their ass. There are times when the president doesn't want to know what's going on. Arguably, the Quds Force in Iran does stuff that the president of Iran says, I had no idea they were doing that, but he didn't want to have an idea they were doing it. So, for example, after 9/11, America invades Afghanistan, and within a year, George W. Bush, the president, is in Congress saying, 2/3 of all Al Qaeda have been captured or killed. That was true. What he didn't say is about half of those who have been captured by the Iranians, and that the Iranians then started to drip them back into Afghanistan and other parts of the Middle East to make trouble for the Americans. So, governments lie. What do you do with stuff like this? Here we have Professor Strangelove. He was major in the old program, and he's a very good biochemist. And there's a big article in the Imperial College Sans Serif magazine about his retirement party. But we know, gee, he's retiring early. Why? What do you do? In the military, you do facial recognition stuff, where you just analyze the photographs. And it turns out there were several members of the Presidential Guard attending his retirement. That's strange. Including the President's Chief of Staff. And then there's a source briefing that, oh, he's just moving to an isolated part of the coast. He's going to be scuba diving. Then you get a defector. He's claiming asylum in a South American country, just like Curveball did. Curveball from Iraq claimed asylum in Germany, started feeding us information. And that South American country says that this guy was really pissed off about the decision to abandon the weapons program. And he felt he was going to be demoted, so he just went ahead and defected. What do we make of that? Is he telling the truth? Is he a plant? You get the point. Oh, and he's vague. Plans for the facility. Okay. What do you guys think? Are you gonna? People of San Serif are under sanction. They're starving. Your job is to tell, are they real? Should America invade San Serif because they've got a biological weapons program? Or should we lift all sanctions because obviously they're good people and this is hard, right? There's nothing decisive. How do you weigh evidence? When you've got all this ambiguous evidence, how do you weigh it? Here's what you do. You use a tool called analysis of competing hypotheses, or ACH. It is used by the CIA to try to sort through this ambiguous information. But I use the same framework to sort through whether I should or should not invest in a particular business. You put up the chart and you start working. So it was developed at CIA to overcome bias. I know biases are not bad or good. You inevitably have them. The question is, are you aware of them and how do you account for them? How do you sort through things in spite of bias? So I would just remind you of a hypothesis, declarative statement that is not established as true. Milo is a genius. It's my hypothesis. It has not been established as true. I would remind you, when you're doing science, you're not trying to prove anything. You're trying to disprove things. And that's frankly where most consulting firms get it wrong. I've worked at a consulting firm. If a client has a problem, they say, please help us. You go in, you do an initial survey, you come up with what you think the problem is, and then you go out and you collect a lot of information to prove that you're right. That is not science. Ideally, you try to pick the hypothesis with the least evidence against it, not the most evidence for it. You always find it easier to gather facts to support the idea you favor. And consistent evidence doesn't prove anything because several things, evidence can point in several directions and support more than one hypothesis. I'll make this more clear in a minute. I know it's boring. So what's the goal of this tool? The goal of the tool is to help you figure out what information really is diagnostic in this decision. Like a doctor trying to figure out, someone comes in with a complaint, how does the doctor diagnose what's really wrong? You don't want to be distracted by your natural bias to start gathering evidence to favor one view. You're trying to disprove things. That's science. That's all right. You can say. A big problem intelligence agencies have is you can gather stuff in a super cool way, or you can gather information with a $3 billion satellite. And there's a real tendency to be like, hey, that piece of information that probably cost us $1 billion. And you're trying to refute that with an article in the newspaper? Yeah, sometimes the article in the newspaper is right, and the $1 billion satellite gave you a piece of information that wasn't decisive. So you got to figure out what information is really diagnostic. Is this clear? Or is it just boring and opaque? Combination. What we're focused on is, as you're out collecting information, how do you decide which information really matters? I gave you a bunch of stuff about what was going on in Sensoria. You've got Dr. Strangelove retiring. You've got missing lab technician. You've got a VPN in operation. You've got rumors of new facilities being established, but that's not been proven. You've got a defector who says the president canceled the program. Which of those really matter? How do you figure that out? That's what this framework does. What do? Step one, you generate hypotheses. What could be going on? Step two, you construct a matrix. So it's not rocket science so far, right? A, there is a weapons of mass destruction program, and the president knows it. B, there is not a weapons of mass destruction program. C, there is a weapons of mass destruction program, but only part of the government knows it, and so on. Here, just to bring you back to the real world to show why this stuff is hard, you frequently have what's called red on red deception, where there's an internal program in a country to deceive its own people or its own military about what's really going on. So prior to 2003, if every Iraqi general facing the United States had been on the CIA paper, and we could call them up and say, hey, do you guys have chemical weapons? Most of them would have said, well, my unit doesn't have them, but I'm pretty sure the guys on my left and the guys on my right do. Because Saddam Hussein had to simultaneously convince the UN that they didn't have them, but his own people and his own military that he did have them, because he didn't want the Iranians to attack, and he didn't want the Kurds to rise up, and he didn't want the Shia to rise up. So sometimes even people in their own country don't know what the hell is going on. So it's very complicated. Nevertheless, you start here. So far, that's not very spectacular. Obviously, you guys know MECE? No? Okay. It's a McKinsey thing. What is it?
Mutually
it's a card thing.
Yeah, mutually exclusive, collectively exhaustive.
Right. Logically complete. When you're coming up with hypotheses, they're on the x-axis. Ideally, these have to be mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive, which is a fancy way of saying logically complete. So if I categorize you guys by year of birth, I can sort you by year of birth. That's MECE. There's no way any of you were born in 2 years. But if I said I'm going to categorize my class by citizenship, that's not MECE, because you might have more than one passport. So you get it, right? So that's the ideal. Then you start listing significant evidence you would find. And this is all boring as hell, I get it. You start listing the evidence you expect to find. But here's where it gets weird. You also say, hypothesis A, Sensory has a weapons of mass destruction program that they're hiring. That's A. You list the stuff that you're finding in favor of that hypothesis. So importing mountains. when you want to test biological weapons, you can either use prisoners or you can use monkeys. And we're assuming sensory doesn't have monkeys of their own, so they're free monkeys. Wow, that's in favor. But then you say, hold on. If that's true, if they're doing that program, what would we expect to see? And do we see it? And that's again where analysis gets created. You're asking yourself actively, if each hypothesis is true, what would I expect to see, and do I see it? So to take a trivial example, if the hypothesis A is there's a drought in Sans Serif, and you see would I expect to see puddles? No. If the satellite, well, do I see puddles? Yes or no? If I see puddles, then the hypothesis A is not true. It's decisive, it's diagnostic. I like to keep things confusing. Let me explain to you where things get complicated. People have asked about deception. Analysis of competing hypotheses is also used to plan deception. When you're thinking, we want to hide this, and we want them to believe that, you ask yourself, okay, what would they expect to see if that's true? And how do I make sure that they see it? Prior to the Allied landings at D-Day, which had the anniversary of D-Day, the Allies were very keen to convince the Nazis that the Normandy operation, the main operation, was actually a fake one, and that the main one would be up in Pas-de-Calais, different part of the coast. To do that, they invented a big fake army up in northern England. They had inflatable tanks, inflatable, fake airplanes and stuff lined up. They had our best General Patton, driving around up there because that's what the Germans would expect to see. But they also said, hold on, what else would the Nazis expect to see if there's really a big army waiting up in northern England to invade somewhere else? And they remembered that, gee, let's see, British men are all off fighting somewhere else, and supposedly there's a huge group of American and Canadian army people been stationed up there for 6 months. So British intelligence literally planted hundreds of fake wedding announcements in northern newspapers in the 6 months prior to the invasion, because that's what the Germans would expect to see if there really are hundreds of thousands of Americans and Canadian guys wandering around northern England. Accidents happen, so to speak. People fall in love. So they did fake wedding announcements because if you're going to convince them, you make sure they see. Thinking about absolute evidence forces you to actively look for things to disprove your situation. It's like being a good cop. A good police officer investigating a murder does not try to focus on one person and prove they did it. They try to say who has the motive, the means, and the opportunity, and then disprove it. Okay, Anaya could not have done the murder. He had the motive and he had the means, but he didn't have the opportunity. He was in Newark this weekend. Meanwhile, Milo had motive, means, and opportunity, and I can't prove he didn't do it. You're trying to disprove now. Okay? Nice and simple. Then you start filling in the matrix. Then you start refining, start rewording hypotheses. You really think hard about this. I'm going to give you an example, so don't get too wrapped up here. But you start deleting hypotheses if you're finding a lot of evidence against it. It's impossible. Then you end up ranking hypotheses. And the winner is the one with the least evidence against it, not the most evidence for it. It's really weird. The problem with this method is that's not how people think. You don't sort of say, here are the possibilities, let me now go just prove that. But it works. Then you do the comments. So, another reason you might choose to use this method is here. If your boss says, we need you to make a recommendation, and you use this method, at the very least, you're going to have an audit trail of how you arrived at a reasoned judgment. So let's move right to an example. Hypothesis 1 is sensory has the biological weapons program. Hypothesis 2 is there is not. I simplified it because, as I had said, there could be they have one, but the president doesn't know about it. Let's just keep it for today nice and simple. We know they were lying about this in the past. Now, validation is another column you tend to use because you're trying to figure out the reliability of it. That kind of confirms hypothesis 1. And it kind of works against hypothesis 2. Maybe. Remember what we were doing yesterday, though? Where once you put things up in a structured analytic technique and framework, people start debating it, and that's a good thing. The other good thing about analysis competing hypothesis is if you put it up on a whiteboard at work, we should invest in this company, we should not invest in this company. We should enter this market, we should not enter this market. And you start putting up evidence for and against. People start debating. And that's healthy and good. That too helps you arrive at good decisions. Diplomatic sources saying there's a covert biological weapons program. Well, that's in favor of hypothesis 1. What about this? The secure VPN confirms. How useful is something that confirms both hypothesis 1 and hypothesis 2? I see some people shaking their heads. Exactly. That evidence, so-called evidence, has no diagnostic value. You can use VPNs for lots of things. Just because they used to use the VPN for biological weapons and it's still being used, doesn't mean it has no bearing on the question. So a good thing about this method, even though it's clunky and it's a weird way of thinking and it's boring, it forces you to say, hold on, does this really help me make a decision? And that secure VPN, because it could be used for anything. I mean, governments have secrets. It's useless. So you tend to cross those off. You don't delete them, but you cross them off and say, okay, that evidence has no diagnostic value. Shortage of lab technicians. President ordered it stopped. Wow. You know, pretty decisive, unless there's deception. So by the way, I am not here to defend the American decision to invade Iraq in 2003 on the basis of were there or were there not weapons of mass destruction. But I hope if you learned nothing else today, it's that making judgments like that actually turns out to be pretty hard. It's not simple. It's like, that idiot can see that they were under sanctions, so they weren't. It's hard. Let's see. Professor Strangelove retires early. Useful or not? You don't know whether it's part of the deception plan. He was associated with the presidential guard. Yeah. So you start debating, is this useful? You've got the defective major. Somebody at break came to me and said, how do I overcome bias? Is there a method? This is the best method I know. It's clunky. It's a weird way of thinking. And it's not science. It's not perfect. But at least it's a framework for debate and organization for taking decisions in the face of ambiguity and uncertainty. Come on.
In the context of WMDs in Iraq, the whole idea that Saddam was picking out UN weapons inspectors and not letting them in, that does fit into both hypotheses.
Right.
But then do you think that the US
sort of took that as hypothesis one because of this.
So from what I know, the CIA genuinely believed he had them. The balance of judgment was he's got them. Otherwise, we wouldn't have used it as an excuse, right? Nobody wants to look stupid. They really thought he had them. Let me tell you an example of where this is true. There was a genuine intercept that totally screwed things up. UN weapons inspectors were going to a suspect site. And you had to tell the Iraqis which site you were visiting 2 days in advance. So the UN weapons inspector said, we will be visiting that particular site in 2 days. We then intercept a phone call from Baghdad to that base. And they say, hey, Colonel, you're in charge of that base. Make goddamn sure the UN weapons inspectors don't find it. Okay. Then we intercept another call. The guy in charge of the base calls back and says, holy shit, there is stuff here. What do I do with it? What do I do with it? The smoking gun, right? And they're like, get rid of it, get rid of it, get rid of it, hide it. They're coming in 2 days, get rid of it. That looks pretty decisive. Except the problem was the stuff he found was stuff that had been left over from the first Gulf War that they just never disposed of. There's some old mustard gas and stuff, but it's stuff they're not supposed to have had. They're supposed to have gotten rid of it. They didn't get rid of it. It was just this old crap. But it really made it look like, if you just read that intercept, you'd be like, damn, they're dirty. And after the war, we figured out, yeah, what the guy had found was a bunch of old stuff, and he didn't want the UN weapons inspectors to find the old stuff. So even stuff that looks super decisive can later prove to be a mistake. There's no science to this. And I would suggest to you, even if you're just doing business planning or investment hypothesis or whatever, there is no magic answer machine. So here's how I organize this. And by the way, for longer classes that I teach, doing your own chart rather than me giving it to you is a take-home assignment for group work. You have to sort through the cases, you get all the cases, and you got to come up with your own analysis for being a hypothesis chart. Because the way you learn to do stuff is to do it. But we didn't have time for this class. So what do you guys think? Is there or is there not? Are the sensory guilty or not? Are they doing this stuff when they shouldn't, or what do you think? Those who believe that the noble people of Sans Serif, though they may be noble, still have a biological weapons program, please raise your hand. I guess the rest of you think that we should lift sanctions and they're friendly people, and that's that. I told you about this book yesterday. What I've just tried to do as quickly as possible, and as unboring as possible, but I didn't succeed, is teach you chapter 8 of this. This will lay out the framework. A few more thoughts on this stuff. The strengths of this method is it's relatively rigorous. If you're trying to say, how do I sort through bias? This is one way, because it really forces you to say, I need to disprove every hypothesis I can come up with. I'm going to go out and I'm going to search to disprove every hypothesis I can come up with. And not just it's about disproving, but it's about saying, and I'm going to consider absent evidence. What would I expect to see, and do I see it? So when I teach this in extended classes, we don't just do this. I ask my students to consider, did the man from Stratford write the plays of William Shakespeare? Hypothesis A is William Shakespeare wrote the plays of William Shakespeare. Hypothesis B is somebody else wrote the plays of William Shakespeare. You can use this method for anything. Yes, I am not exploring it for the avoidance of doubt. The Stratford man did not write the plays. There is no absolute answer. God gave physics the problem. You're not doing physics. you're considering investments, you're doing business plans, you're looking for weapons of mass destruction. But it does force you to really figure out what information is truly diagnostic. Remember I said yesterday, before making a decision, you should ask, what could I learn that would make me change my mind? That's exactly what you're doing here. You've got an organized way of saying, what could I learn that would make me change my mind? And am I finding it? So it's nice. And if you put one up for a decision that sits on your wall for a week and people can add to it and subtract to it and so on, it's useful. It's not decisive, but it's useful. Structured thinking, exchange of ideas, and an audit trail of your thinking. On the other hand, people don't find it normal to say, what are all the possibilities? Now let me go disprove as many of them as I can. It's certainly not how most consulting assignments work. It's certainly how most investment decisions, people will say, pitch me on your idea. It's what I've asked you to do in your assignment. Essentially, I've said, pitch me on your idea for wealth preservation. I haven't said, come up with 10 hypotheses for wealth preservation and disprove them as many as you can and pick the one with the least evidence against it. But if I were really making an investment decision, that's what I'd do. The other thing is, it's a pain in the ass. It's time consuming. And the other thing is, there are software packages. I don't like them because you end up treating the framework as a magic answer machine. I've actually given you guys a bunch of frameworks. Of course, I gave you McLuhan's tetrad. Most business students don't have that. I gave you all yesterday. I gave you the Allison model, life as a poker game, a chess match, a soccer game, football. I gave you the whole thing about now surprise reaction. No, and presume no. All of these things are out there. But they're tools for thinking. They're not magic answer machines. And it's the same with super forecasting. There are no guarantees. We're a little early. Any questions? Yes.
How much wealth do we start with when we're writing our assignment? Because it's different if you can buy land or if you can just buy one.
You have to
Right.
you have to make assumptions. Just tell me the amount you're starting with. I know exactly how much money I need to feel rich. And it's, by the way, usually it's probably not as much as you think. Real wealth is first security for yourself and your family, and then freedom to do what you want. It lets me teach for fun. I don't need, that's not true. If you added a zero to my income, there's one change I would make to my life. But I would like more money. I would prefer a NetJet card to having to fly. I don't give a shit about my car.
But should it be closer to 1 million or 1 billion?
For the assignment, just tell me your assumption. For me personally, it is nowhere close to $1 billion. It's not even close to $100 billion. It's much closer to the low end of. Honestly, it's all about what you want. But sooner or later, I'm buying this house in France this week, next month, September. Why do I need that? So I'm following the Charlie Munger rule. I don't spend money I don't have on something I don't need. Spending money I have on something I want. But the hardest part of that acquisition is to make sure that house doesn't end up owning me. Right? It's really stupid. It makes my wife happy. Happy wife, happy life. So there's no ideal amount. It's going to be a different answer for each person. I know a woman who was born in a trailer, total peasant, who's made buttloads of money. I know she makes like $30 million. Makes $30 million. She's super disappointed because she didn't get selected for the Chicago Olympic Committee. Right? She just drives her crazy. All her other rich friends are on the Olympic Committee in Chicago. That's what she needs. I don't need that. Any other questions? Sorry to get philosophical about that. Why should you come back after lunch, after such a boring time? A, because no more tools and frameworks. The final sessions are really, I'm gonna present a little bit, but most of it is gonna be about you guys asking me questions and us kind of doing a general geopolitical talk, all the themes of the course, but also contemporary conflicts and stuff that matter. Okay, I'm gonna talk a little bit about the Middle East and Ukraine and other things. We will finish early. But you should come back after lunch. I'll be like super sad. You don't hurt my feelings, do you? I mean, you me. Thank you all very much. Thank you.
I know I'm like